at the Resistance Museum in Oslo, and what we're going to learn about is the takeover of Norway during World War II. We just watched a little video on it, and it's going to be very interesting. And anything else you'd like to add?
Well, it's all about after the Germans came in and occupied the many different groups of resistance workers. The Norwegian government rejected the plans of the German to occupy, and of course that didn't do any good. So the Germans came in and blasted, and they occupied the country from 1940 to 1945. Quisling was the head of the Norwegian Nazi Party, and he made it easy for the Germans to come. And on April 9th, 1940, Germany started their occupation. And at that same day, Quisling made himself prime minister.
And then in Norwegian, the word for treason is now Quisling, kind of like we have Benedict Arnold.
True, but many places in the world, Quisling is the name for a traitor.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. It's at least for me, it was a familiar name. In all reality, the Norwegian people were ashamed of Quisling and what he had done. The German government thought that they would have less resistance if they got Quisling out of there, because that's what the people wanted.
Yeah.
And before this all started, the king of Norway went to England. They invited him to go to England, and his wife, the queen, and their 3 children slipped into Sweden. But soon after, Franklin Roosevelt invited her to come over, and she went over to New York, and she stayed there until the end of the war, but the two of them didn't see each other for many, many years. We found out earlier that King Haakon, he went to England, but the thing is, he did speeches over the BBC that kept his countrymen, the Norwegians' morale up. And again, this is where the clandestine bulletins in the newspapers that were distributed, this is where they got most of the information. And this was outlawed everywhere, that you had a radio. Most countries, other than the elite or the Germans, you couldn't have a radio because you're going to get the truth then. And maybe you do something about the situation rather than think it was hopeless. Hitler sent a huge force into Norway because in the back of his mind he thought that's where the Allies were going to come, and he sent this force to stop them. And this was the commander of them all, General Nicholas von Falkenhorst. Terboven was appointed by Hitler to be head of the Nazification of Norway. And there are limits in war. There are rules and regulations.
International law.
Yes, but he went way beyond it, which of course most of them did. So. This is a diorama picturing people escaping probably to Sweden. There's another picture somewhere through the snow. They were trekking through the snow. Part of the resistance movement and part of that special group of people was to smuggle people out of the country. And they needed, again, people who would supply papers for them, people who could guide them out of the country. It was really a well-oiled machine. I think one person or two knew what they were doing and the next group didn't. So if they were caught, not the whole group would go down. There were like 46,000 people that escaped out. The Nazis were producing heavy water, and that was to extract the atoms for the atom bomb. This was Hitler's baby. There were 2 attempts by soldiers that came parachuted in or glided in. The first was a failure. Most of them were killed, sadly. The second was a success. They made it into that factory, down where they needed to be, and they blew it up, and they got out successfully. And Hitler was so mad he wanted those captured, but they escaped successfully. And then about a year later, they built it up again, and a year later, the planes came and blew it up for good. Mm-hmm. He couldn't get it up to fast enough to do what he wanted to do with it. In April 1942, two SOE agents, Norwegian SOE agents, were sent here, and they were found out, and they were forced to kill 2 German soldiers, while the Germans retaliated and killed 18 Norwegians at the same time. And they did that whenever they retaliated, and that's how they kept control. You don't do this, we'll kill 500 of blah, blah, blah.
But that further ticked them off and made them want to resist more.
But the SOE was a spy agency, actually, and I think the head of it was in England. This was a Norwegian one in England, and the recruits went to New York and just above the border into Canada. They had a training ground, and they trained. And this is where they trained their recruits into all the things they needed to do to gain information and not get caught. Transmitters and English operators that knew how to work and came over and trained Norwegian resistance men or women. But the Nazis had a sophisticated way of tracking them down. So these people could give a message, but they'd have to head out real fast, turn it off, head out real fast, and go someplace else so they weren't caught. They didn't have very little money coming in, and it says that their arms were running low, and so they decided to make their own, maybe in machine shops in a basement somewhere. They made Sten guns, which were guns. They also made Molotov cocktails, which was gasoline usually in a jar with a material wick, so they'd light it and throw it. But they were so courageous and so determined, and sometimes I would imagine there wasn't much hope, but they continued to do what they could do to try to help their country. I love it. I read a quote which I thought was quite interesting, and that was, "A generation that is neither taught or loves their country will not defend their country." Something to think about. This is how the resistance agents would carry and receive different clandestine information. And the first one, heel hollowed out to conceal film strip.
Okay, which is in the heel right there.
Yeah.
Okay, then what's this one?
And this one is letter with chemical writing. These are films hidden inside of a loaf of bread.
Look at here. This is all microdotted. And then
one little tiny dot.
and then they were able to look through here, which you can't really see, but it turns into this.
Can you try it out? No.
Okay. But that's what's here.
After a bit, we're going to tell you a story that we were told last night of a father of a good friend who was in resistance in
Denmark.
In Denmark. And it includes a bicycle and the handlebars.
So stay tuned. So I have read a lot of children's historical fiction books with my kids when they were younger, and a couple of them are Number the Stars, which is, I'll go into that another time, but that's a really, really good book about the resistance in Denmark. And then another one is called Snow Treasure, the true story of Norwegian school children who smuggled gold on their sleds underneath them down a mountain past the German guards onto a waiting ship. And so they were able to be a part of the resistance too.
Yes, part of that was the national treasure.
Yeah, but the children were were a good part of it. And so if you need a very good short book to read that is super interesting, Snow Treasure.
The king has returned home. On May 13th, 1945, King Olaf returned on one of these ships in the harbor of Oslo. He's home, and the whole country, of course, like England, like many all around the world, celebrated the war was done.
we're sitting in the middle of the fjord, the Oslo fjord, and right over there is Western Oslo, kind of right in the middle, and then behind us is downtown, and then over here we're in the eastern part of Oslo, and we just went to the Resistance Museum, and then you can see the fjord goes out into the sea.
A friend of ours, her father was captured. She was 6.5 years old. In the middle of the night, they heard this terrible, terrible pounding on it, and in comes the Nazi soldiers, and they wrecked the living room and they wrecked the bedroom, and they take away the father.
Oh, I think it's starting to rain on us. Yeah, they took the father away, and
the reason they came to that door that night in the middle of the night was because he was a part of the resistance. He had been caught. He was taking information, some of these newsletters, to different places, and he had a list in his bike, in the handle. You know, you take that grip off, and there's
in the handlebar.
And so he put it in there, and they searched that bike. They found this list within an hour.
The list of all the people in the resistance group that they were supposed to distribute all the leaflets out to different people. So the list was on there, and then within 1 hour.
Yeah, within 1 hour they were all arrested. He was taken to a prison locally for a couple, 3 or 4, 5 weeks. But then he was sent to Sachsenhausen. I think I got that right. And in Germany, and he was there for many, many years. The interesting thing that I hadn't known before, because I spent a lot of my life reading about this, because my dad was in this war for 4.5 years, was that the Red Cross, somebody had somehow eased it with Hitler or the Germans, that instead of spending so much money on these prisoners, why don't we take some of them off the Red Cross? Why don't we take them off your hands, and then you don't have to think about it. So they were called the white buses. There was like 40 white buses. They painted them white, and they put a red cross on the top for the Red Cross, and somehow he got on one of those, and the wife found out about it, and so she took a taxi, she spent all of that to get there. They had 1 hour together. They hadn't seen each other for years. And then he was taken off again. So she came back home soon.
He was taken off for 9 weeks.
Yeah.
They got them all over to Sweden. And then so they had like a reintroduction into society camp where they started to eat slowly, and then just psychological evaluations and different things. And so 9 weeks later, all the prisoners came back from their time in Sweden. Yeah.
So what a reunion that was.
Yeah, but she sat down with us last night with all of us, and she gave us, she just talked and for a couple hours, and the kids were able to listen to it all, and we were all just fascinated and just so happy that she shared her story, but she didn't want to be on video, and that is totally respected, and so we just thought we would share a little bit because we saw a lot of the same kind of stuff in here, like with the bicycles and just all the different ways that they were able to resist. Again, that was in Denmark, but same concept. Yeah. So we hope you guys enjoyed the time here, and it was very, very informative to us. And again, her dad was in World War II for 4.5 years, so anything that we can see like this is very interesting and good for us. So.